to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Fletcher, and joining me from the snowy hills of Austin is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how's it going over there, man?
It's cold. Like, the Northerners need to come get their weather. It's drunk. I don't know what's doing here. Like, I just want to go to the data center and like find the biggest storage array and sit on the hot aisle and just sit behind it to like regain feeling in my hands and my legs.
Yeah. Do people know how to drive in Texas when you have snow? I don't know.
Absolutely not. Look, for context, when I lived in Houston, it hit 31 degrees. We just shut down every airport. Like, de-icing? No, that's terrifying. Like, it's, yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah, we're a little bit used to it here in North Carolina, but it doesn't make it any warmer, man. I'm not enjoying it. But hey, you and I were having a conversation with one of our OG friends, Mr. Cody Hosterman, the other day. We were reminiscing about the days of Explorer, presenting different sessions, which kind of morphed into the idea of best practices. Some of the sessions we've done on best practices, and for those that know Cody, he's been in the world of. I mean, we used to work at EMC, and then moved on to Pure, and he's written a lot of good content over the years, and is no stranger to best practices. And so we started talking about the evolution of best practices, and I thought, let's bring Cody on. Let's catch up with him, see what he's doing. But I would love to chew on that same topic that we talked about not too long ago, the idea of best practices and sort of like what the origin of best practices are and what we do to make them better. Cody, welcome back to Virtually Speaking. How you doing, sir?
Doing great. It's awesome to be back. And Nicholson, you're going to have to dig up a spinning disk array to probably find that warmth from a storage array in the data center. And you're not going to find it.
That QLC is too cold. The QLC is too cold.
Yeah, it's a good point, man. I hadn't even thought about that. Harkening back to the old days. Yeah, that spinning rust is gonna keep you warm, but not QLC. So Cody, what have you been up to these days? You've been busy.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. My role has transformed a bit over the past couple of years at Pure. I've been a little bit of, I'm still on the keyboard, but it's more on the office productivity side of the keyboard than the logging into the technology side, as I've shifted my focus into product management. But these days I've been driving our virtualization strategy, or VMware strategy, but really my team focuses specifically on the public cloud, right? So I manage our product management team for our public cloud investments, as well as we call them technical product specialist team. The solutions architects is another word you might use, of our cloud SMEs, and just really building out and focusing on our cloud business. So, which is tightly related to our virtualization business, which is the reason I got my feet in both.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, we were talking the other day, and I was reminiscing over, just some of the documentation that you used to write back for EMC, like just for SRM and for different things, just for vSphere, just getting a core understanding of, like, back then was like, okay, HA had to be configured a certain way. Disk groups, everything had to be configured a very specific way.
Alua. I need to think about Alua a lot for some reason. It sounds Hawaiian. What is this? Yeah.
Yeah, and heck, I've had my my share of presentations at the old VMworld about, like, best practices for vSphere, or if you're using certain storage, this is what you have to do. But ultimately, those things are basically saying, like, everyone has a different opinion. From my perspective, tell me if you agree. A lot of those best practices were kind of like bugs, but essentially just shortcomings of the software that they should be doing these things themselves. You shouldn't have to worry about them. But since you do, it's a best practice. Do you agree?
Yeah, I explicitly use that term of best practices are bugs, right? To your point, when I was at EMC, I spent a lot of time just understanding how things worked in the storage stack, right? From the VMware side down to the storage side. And then, when I came to Pure, we had this, like, just heavy emphasis on simplicity, and to make things simple, that why around things is really important. And so I started with the mindset of, like, all right, we have these best practices, like, why? And, like, these are product problems. This should be our roadmap, right? Not just an ever-growing list of things for our customers to deal with. And so spent a lot of time really digging into why. My second day at Pure, I just deleted our best practice documentation basically. And I was like, let me just re-go through this and understand why we're making this recommendation and what we can do on our products with our partnership with VMware to remove these things in different ways, right? So I 100% agree. Best practices are absolutely bugs or yet to be completed roadmap items, if you want to put maybe a nicer spin to it.
Yeah, this is something really I like to chew on here because, I think through all the different settings that out of the box, over the years that people have to set, and they just normalize, oh yeah, you should have to tweak the round robin, how many blocks before it skips to the other, or jumbo frames or whatever. Why do I have to think about this? Why shouldn't the system go detect and go configure this? And best practices also, like, it feel like it became like a weird, almost like religious attitude of like, well, some high priest 10 years ago chiseled this in a VVD or something, and so we keep doing this. And I remember actually asking about a specific network setting, and I was like, well, where did this come from? They're like, well, this actually came from you. And I'm like, what? They're like, we had a hallway conversation 8 years ago, and I wrote this down in the VVD. I'm like, oh no, I am the mysterious elder who was inadvertently caused, the followers to favor that. But I like working backwards from that principle design. First off, do a clean slate periodically. It needs to be done. But two, that idea of how do we get this out of the box just set so we don't annoy the users? Because that is something I know engineering and QE time is very expensive. Making any product change on your side is expensive. But you going through the hassle of doing that so that 40,000 customers don't have to all go turn the same knob, that's big.
Yeah. I mean, snapshots, right? Like there's so many. I was thinking about this. I was making I didn't write it down, but I had a list in my head of some of the older ones that were like how to manage your snapshots, like because of and it's all based on performance and if the software can't do it itself, you clearly want to have these best practices, right? It should do it itself, but it's like, don't have this many snapshots for too long, or otherwise you're going to have performance issues. This is how you configure HA, John, for vSAN, right? Like, this is how you configure your disk group, because back in the day we had to make sure.
What of those exist? But the snapshot's a big one though, because I'm constantly having to interrupt people on Reddit threads where people are like, "No, don't keep a snap more than 72 hours." I'm like, "Look, guys, if it's an offloaded snap on an NFS, if you've got vvols, like, it's fine. Like, it's fine. Like, there's." If you're worried about this, go use vvols, like, or make sure it's offloaded to the file system. But I guess one question I had for you, Cody, to turn this back around, what have been some of the challenges of making those changes from the product side, but also of communicating them and knocking out, the cobwebs out of everybody's head of what they've learned and get them to unlearn that, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? Because I used to do the session back in the day with Cormac, and then Jason more recently around best practices around storage, and I would deliver the message of just like, I would rather you consistently configure things wrong than inconsistently configure things correctly, right? Because then it's at least easier to troubleshoot. It's like, which host did I increase my queue depths on, or whatever, right? And so how we work through that was always fun, right? And VMware makes that I don't want to say a larger problem, but it's a good thing in the sense that, like, applications and workloads are so mobile across hosts, it's so easy to move them that consistency is just super important, right? And so my message is like, just do things consistently, right? And trying to dig into some of these best practices, I think there's a couple examples that jump into mind on how we deliver that and how we work through it, right? It was, in ESX, I want to say it was 6.5, there was a manual unmap operation. And there was a parameter in there around the block size around the unmap operation. And I started playing around with it. And I was like, whoa, sometimes it's faster if I change this block size. Why? I don't know, but let me figure out when, right? And so I spent this is the early days of Pure, where I just kind of could just sit and do whatever I want to figure things out. It's just like, hey, everything's good, right? The good old days where it's just like, hey, just everything's impactful. So do whatever makes you happy, right? And I was testing all this stuff over and over again. And I found the rule was, if I recall, 1%, the sweet spot around speed of unmap was taking 1% of the free capacity of the data store and then setting the block size or the block count or whatever to equal that. That was the optimal speed. So I'm like, okay, got the win, but why, right? And so, I put out, I remember I was putting out some recommendations and best practices around some of these things. And, people always ask for a number, like not like an equation to like figure out
Yeah.
best practice. And provided both, well, the equation on my blog and the best practice in our documentation. And I started seeing some like other vendors using very similar recommendations. So I decided to play a game where I just arbitrarily made up a number that I knew was like in that right realm, just to see if that exact number would appear elsewhere. And it 100% did, right? And so the key about this stuff, right, is that like there's significant impact just broadly when you make these kind of recommendations, like it beyond even your own customer base. It can influence things. And so figuring this out and solving it is really important. And I had a kind of a 4-pronged approach, still do, right, around best practices is when we identify a recommendation that customers need to make, or some of them, right, need to change they need to make. The first thing we do is look at our product. Can we improve how our product behaves? And I think an example maybe I'll use to run through this is disk max IO size. It used to split IOs, I think, at 32 megabytes. And like back then, our SCSI read operations were limited to 7. And so basically, if ESX issued a larger one than that, it would blue screen VMs, right? And UEFI boot with Windows was specifically problematic around this. And so customers had to tweak that down. And so first we're like, okay, can we improve our product? And we're like, yeah, we can increase our SCSI read op support and our read buffers and things like that internally so that doesn't happen. And that was a large project. The other side of it is like, okay, can VMware create, like you have default rules in ESX around multipathing. Can there be a rule there? But as we dug into it, we went into the next step of my like operating model is fix it on our product, but can we work with our competitor, or not our competitor, our partner rather, to solve it more broadly, right? And so what we ended up doing there was we did both. We improved our SCSI read stuff because there's use cases beyond that. But what we did with VMware is we're like, well, this information about our supported SCSI operation side is in our VPD information. Why can't ESX just read that and then just do that, right? Which is how it behaves now. And so this whole changing disk max IO size has no relevance to this particular problem anymore. It's just solved out of the box, just works right out of that. The third phase is, all right, let's use a plugin or something or a script or whatever to, not make it the customer's problem specifically. And then, whatever. And the last phase is documentation, right? And all of that should feed the roadmap, fill the bugs, send it upwards across the stack. And that's how we've worked through. That's how I've worked through that model. And I think generally it's gotten us to where we are today, where I think is this fairly out of the box behaviors between the VMware layer and our product. And I think broadly that's had an impact.
It's interesting because every time I think like, oh, storage is going to get boring, no one's going to find any weird bug. Like it's old. Like, yeah, we fixed the unmapped crashing from the 5.0 era. Like nothing new weird is going to happen. Then we're like, oh, let's do NVMe over FC. Has anyone tested this? I don't know. Like there's always one new challenge in one layer. And that is why I love having partners that try to drive not only themselves forward, but drive us forward and work together on this stuff. Because I know storage people tend to be a little more conservative, but at the same time, we've got to move on to the next layer. And the jump from magnetic to flash was a huge one in terms of we found all kinds of weird bottlenecks across everybody's IO path. But as we push forward, adapting to QLC, adapting to PLC, changes in the finally moving away from SCSI for underlying transit. There's still opportunity for stuff to get weird. There's still opportunity for simplicity. RFCs, T10 may be chiseled, but T11 is still, an evolving area. There's areas there. So it's good to see that. I do like this approach, and hopefully it'll push us all to just work. And it's one thing I will note across the storage industry in general. I love working with you guys, but also I was talking to one of the guys on the open compute group who was the storage chair, and he was talking about how it's kind of fun with storage is that in a lot of other industries, people who are, partners or sometimes competitors across different areas, they're a little kind of cagey or things. But I feel like in storage, we're all just so committed to not losing data and not crashing stuff. There is a bit more congeniality of like, okay, we've got to work together to like just make stuff not crash. It's fun, especially watching NVMe evolve in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. most best practices, the biggest problem I've always had with them is they're static, right? For the most part, like if there's been a problem today, this is how you fix it. This is how you work around it. But it's pretty static. And, I'm curious what your perspective is on like automation and how that plays into, maybe replacing best practices, but there's always going to be something that needs to be a best practice. So how does automation play into fixing some of these static best practices?
Yeah, and that's a key path, and was a key driver of all of this, right? Is that when I talk about simplicity of the product, it's the product being simple is one piece, but how simple it is to use up the stack is another piece of simplicity, right? That's an important one, maybe more important in many ways. And as we are seeing more and more very large scale environments across the board, where there's more hosts, there's more dynamicism across the board, automation around these configurations and settings is where things were going, right? And like the more you need to automate around settings, the more risk there is. There's the more things that can go wrong, and so that's why we tried to reduce that list. But the list is never going to probably be zero. We're always going to find new things to go after. But moving towards that more automated end-to-end stack is where all of us, right, saw things going. And so working towards that, and how do we build it out? And I think some of these more managed offerings, right? We're talking about roll your own private public hybrid cloud with VCF, some of the managed offerings around VMware environment. There's these opportunities, ones that we have today, where the configuration and settings of these things are on the vendor, on the provider, on the service provider, as the case may be. And the customer is just really focusing on their applications and their virtual machines, not the underlying infrastructure, right? And so understanding that, building the automation around it, and then having ownership of that instead of the end user or the customer or the application owner, as the case may be, is a key piece of where we are today when talking about things like managed VMware offerings and VCF yourself.
So for those managed offerings, what's cool there is you've got SREs or you've got people on your side working to manage it. And we talk about these improvements in automation here, but a lot of times when you find a setting, you're like, oh, this is a better setting. Like everyone should switch to this. You can't just remotely go turn that knob on everyone's arrays and every colo across America, because there's millions of potential configurations and engineering. Even when you're like, well, let's change the setting in the next update, there's still going to be some like, okay, we got to QC a lot of different configurations. But if you're operating in those public cloud environments where you've got a much more homogeneous config, that SREs can do rolling pushes. There's ways to manage that. I feel like that is fun, that in one time you can adopt those practices faster, but you can also do it in a safe and stable way that is just kind of impossible with the traditional on-prem environment.
Yeah, as Cody kind of alluded to earlier in the conversation, just talking about consistently, I'd rather you be consistent than be, and that kind of speaks to automation, right? Like automation kind of in some ways depends on some level of uniformity, no?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because it's the reason you automate something is you're like, I need to do this many, many times, right? And so like, all right, I'll save myself and run one script, right? And if you have 10 different templates or profiles for your different hosts, it's like, all right, which automation path does it take? So yes, certainly at scale is what we're seeing. And I think, what Nicholson brought up around, or, we both talked a little bit about, is like things like Azure VMware Solution. Like Microsoft has this interface for their partners, such as Pure, right? It's called Run Command Interface. It's widely available for other like prepping of like native Azure VMs and things like that too. But it's an interface into AVS, into their managed offering, to make sure that the vendor's best practices are set. And so the customer doesn't need to do it. We can roll out changes. The customer doesn't have the ability to opt in some of these, but like we can control that at scale. To your point, it's a consistent version of vSphere, and we have very detailed collaborative planning on when upgrades are going to occur, and there's testing zones and things like that to make sure these things go well. And so it does make that much easier. And I did not have to teach our engineers a lot about our VMware storage best practices to build that integration, which is nice, but there's certainly some that come up, and we've had changes that we've had to roll out, and we can roll that out to our customer instead of going, here's our new best practices for Azure VMware Solution and Pure, go ahead and tweak and tune this. It's not their problem. They are aware that some changes or improvements are coming in this rolled out release.
I think back to some of the cab meetings I sat in, years ago. Your change control activity board, where everyone's sitting around, all the stakeholders across the different apps and networking and storage of the data center, and you're like, "Hey, we're looking at changing this setting," and everyone's like, "Well, that sounds scary. Well, I don't know what that is. Will that impact my thing? I don't know. I got to go talk to my vendor." And like five people, I'll leave the room and go talk to five vendors. I like this idea of like having my five vendors all just having this chat and then going and making the change, for me, and I don't have to have five people who really don't even understand the implications of that or why that's there. That sounds like you can definitely have some fun in terms of making stable changes, but also make them a lot more quickly.
Yeah. So what is the name of that solution that you guys have with AVS? I know it's a partnership, but what is that called?
Yeah, so there's two versions of it, if you will, right? So what we have on the truck and what our customers can purchase and buy and are deploying today, right, is our marketplace offering where customers deploy our software, what we call Cloud Block Store, which is our operating software they call Purity that's architected for using in Azure. So a customer can go deploy that, and then we have that run command interface that connects it into their Azure VMware Solution offering, and they can use it as they see fit, right? It's essentially like a custom version of our product where they can use the features, the APIs, whatever as they need, like what they've done in the data center. We also announced at VMware Explore Barcelona last year our evolution of that, which we're calling Pure Storage Cloud, which is a native managed service of our storage inside of Azure, right? So from a customer's perspective, it looks and feels like an Azure service. It's built and supported. It's our SRE team, et cetera, and improved by us in collaboration with Microsoft. So it's our SaaS offering of our storage platform, but looks and feels like a native Azure service. And so it's more click, connect this to my AVS instead of deploy, connect it to my AVS, right? And the onus around lifecycle management, everything like that is on Pure. And one of the cool things about it too is, since it's such a native service, when you log into AVS, everything's just there the first time, right? I feel like this whole program has been like my final exam around like VMware and storage. Of just like, what would you do, right, if you were building a solution for everyone, right?
How do I make sure the PSP is set? How do I make sure the certs are working for VASA so vVols just works out of the box? Like de-risking all of those things.
Exactly. I mean, when the customer logs in after they've deployed our service, right, the vSphere plugin is just there, right? It's deployed into our service for that customer's tenant. So it just appears in the environment. It's registered. It's ready to go. The vVol data store is ready to go. The VASA is registered. That's all there. It's vVols as a service, plugins, everything like that. So it's where we kind of solve things going conceptually of this fully managed partner-based service. But the customer gets all the value of what comes from it. And like vVols is a big piece of that because they just get all that stuff, right, from the service itself and the features that it provides.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember back in the day when vVols was first hitting the scene, and other storage vendors were trying to start and get this thing going. And I remember trying to deploy some of these on various vendors, and I was like, okay, so I got to go step 1 to 12 and hope that I get this VASA provider to actually talk to and make this actually work. And then I remember when Pure came on, I was like, oh wait, this is just working. It's different. And so even from the beginning, I felt like there was some simplicity in terms of getting the VASA provider to work with vVols and just being able to start using it. But I'm curious, what other settings does this, aside from doing the VASA provider, which for a lot of vendors was troublesome, but like what other settings does this actually configure in the storage? Like I know you say you spin up and you can just start using vVols, but what else did you say best practices as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of it is just some of the basic, this is, an Ethernet based, right? So iSCSI and NVMe TCP is something we've introduced to Azure as well. And we're working with the AVS team of bringing that in. That's coming, but right now it's iSCSI based. So the iSCSI configurations around the targets, and there's like no op timeouts, and there's a delayed act, these types of things that we tell customers generally to set are just built into it. Now, we have the benefit of the path selection policies and the storage array type plugin configuration rules built into ESX. So a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, we auto detect that now.
Exactly, right. But the iSCSI configuration of adding in the IPs and making sure those individual settings are set on those particular paths, not at the adapter level, because we don't want to interfere with other iSCSI targets, but at our level is entirely not on the customer to really even be aware of. They can see it inside of ESX, but they can't change it with AVS. And so that's entirely on us and built into that. That's really the core of what we need to do to make sure it's working appropriately.
See, what I love here is I used to really have a love, sometimes hate relationship with plugins, partly because of just the life cycle of them. Is like, oh, I have this plugin and it does this cool thing, and oh, there's a new version of vSphere. Oh, I'm gonna have to wait 9 months, and then I'm gonna have to go through 40 steps to update this. But having this as a managed service, and I know you guys have also been really good at like keeping up with relative day zero on support on this. I feel like we've come a long way in terms of plugins being operationally easy to use versus the operator overhead that they add. And this sounds like truly a sweet spot here.
Yeah, I mean, the plugin, I mean, I haven't used everything on the planet, but like the vSphere plugin framework is the best there is out there. And it's been a long path. The very first vSphere plugin, or it wasn't really called vSphere back then, was a Perl script that we had in our tech book at EMC for Symmetrics. It was copy and paste it. It'll tell you the underlying Symmetrics device ID for this data store. And you plug in the data store, we'll give you the device ID. Cool. That was the first plugin, and it turned into this more Java-based I actually noticed I might have been.
Was that Unisphere? I also feel like you ended up sometimes with from the same vendor. You would end up with like 3 or 4 plugins for some reason because of different components or secondary replication thing. Like it, and then it's like, wait, do these interop? And it's like, okay, I'm having to align planets to do life cycle. Yeah, what I do like is it very much looks like you guys have just kind of, and it's not like in a clown car way, but you've shoved all the different things that you would want to have configured into that plugin framework, and it, there's a bit of a consistency there.
So do you moving up a minute here, do you still think that there's a place in today's IT for best practices to be documented somewhere? Oh,
I mean, absolutely. Like I think, this is what I tell my like solutions architects or TPS team, and yes, we have a TPS report. It's all very funny. But this is, I tell them is like when we're setting up best practices, the thing obviously what we're recommending is important, but like what our customers really need your expertise for is not what the number is or whatever, it's why, right? And I think that's really where the best practice expertise needs to come from the vendors, the ISVs, whatever the case may be, is the why this matters so folks can think about it. So absolutely, if there's something that can be changed or should be changed or in certain scenarios, because there's always some situation where we're going to need to tweak and tune things to get more out of it, right? The one thing I've always said about VMware is it's designed by default for fairness across the board. It's not necessarily designed by default for this thing can push the most right out of the box, because it's a mixed workload, right? And so there's protections built into the system so things don't get out of hand, the noisy neighbor, whatever you want to call it. But if you want to make a neighbor noisy, you can absolutely do it. And here's how and here's why, right? And so there's a huge place for that.
I like that it's that you talk about the fairness in that, and that I remember there was like a case where we were making some improvement within the storage stack, and we're like, oh, this is going to cause a regression of 5% on random writes or something, and like PM was like wringing their hands, but it was gonna double latency consistency. It was like, if storage, you're like, okay, this is a net win, like we should all shut up. But like we were really worried about that, and it's that fairness. Also, the make a neighbor really unnoisy. I feel like that just should be the name, like a subtitle for the extreme performance series, sessions they do at Explore, like how to make the noisiest neighbor possible. Nice. Pete, we're gonna have to like stitch that recording, and it's gonna end up on your soundbar. Make the noisiest neighbor. So,
absolutely. So, the solution that you were talking about earlier, the pure storage cloud for Azure VMware Solutions. This sounds really cool. Where people and we'll leave links in the show notes of this episode for those listening. But that system, that's for people that want to go greenfield. They're doing this. Is there also a migration process for folks that are moving to AVS, and how does Pure get involved in the migrations part of it?
Yeah, certainly, I'd say probably, I'm kind of making this up. This is somewhat anecdotal, but probably 90% of AVS opportunities involve some level of a migration, right? If not entirely. And so there's certainly a lot of ways of doing it. If you're a pure data center customer, like we have our replication technologies and other ways of helping you move that in more efficiently and faster, like absolutely. But there's a whole cavalcade of partners built into the system to help with that. Now, certainly HCX is a continued option there. There's opportunities with Veeam, Jetstream's investing quite a bit around that, Cirrus Data. There's a lot of different partners out there, River Meadow as well, that are helping customers in different ways of build out that migration. So it depends on what you're trying to do and the level of scale that you're trying to move and what you currently have in the data center. But there's a lot of paths. I mean, basically what I tell customers is there's 3,000 ways of getting your data into the public cloud. It's not so much, that's not the problem. It's what happened once it's there is really the larger problem that you need to think through. So, but there's plenty of great options of getting it there in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. I don't even want to go down this rabbit hole, but yeah, certainly when you said that, it made me think of some of our upcoming episodes, which are going to be more focused on repatriation. And I'm sure you have an opinion about that as well.
Things are always moving.
Yeah, things are moving. Absolutely. No matter where you're moving, VMware will be there for you, and so will Pure, right?
Absolutely.
Very good. Well, Cody, again, man, thank you so much for joining us on Virtually Speaking. Again, links in the show notes to some of these solutions and to some of the things that Cody's up to over at Pure Storage. We always love chatting with you. We love seeing you virtually and in person, and looking forward to the next one. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.